So next, oddly enough, we have news stories that are connected, at least conceptually, with a trip that I recently took to Munich. Last week I was in Munich really for a day, basically. I travelled Tuesday, was there on Wednesday, travelled back on Thursday. And I visited the Glyptotek Roman Sculpture Museum and also the Museum of Ancient Egyptian Art. And I was relieved to find out that the word Kunst that I saw everywhere meant art.
That is a very old joke.
No, it is. It's a. I don't mean that as a joke. I mean that genuinely as an as a primarily English speaker. As much as I was brought up speaking Welsh, as a primarily English speaker, it's really quite disconcerting to see. Because I was in that part of Munich where there was lots of art dealers, lots of art galleries, and I was like, "What does this word mean?" It's really distracting. And I met a very nice German guy, and he reassured me it meant art. So I was at the Ancient Egyptian Art Museum, and while I was there, I couldn't help but reflect on what all this stuff meant from a colonial perspective. And obviously, this made me think of, for example, Britain's history on an international colonial level, the British Museum, so on and so forth. And it just so happens that these thoughts came about at around about the same time that Germany has decided to fund museum investigations into the provenance of colonial era artefacts. Also, the European Union is tightening anti-money laundering rules in the art market, and Scotland Yard, in fact, coming back to Britain, has joined a global crackdown on looted pharaonic Egyptian antiquities. It's timely, but I think it's a worthy cause, definitely.
I think so. Before we get into the meat of this particular argument, one thing I'm struck by is that I know Munich is much more than just a provincial city. It's the capital of the land and so on, but and it's a very significant city in its own right. But I can't help but observe that a city that isn't a capital has a museum of Egyptian art, whereas a British equivalent like Northampton got rid of its Egyptian art because it said it wasn't relevant and flogged it for 15.5 million quid
Yeah,
against all advice.
Yeah,
Sakemka.
Yeah,
So and actually that gets us into the whole issue of money and the use of high-end art artifacts to act as basically banks.
yeah.
The value of the money is stored in the artifact.
Yeah, and in this instance, I suppose, in the UK context, I suppose Munich compares as close as it can compares to places like maybe Edinburgh or Cardiff in that sense.
Or Manchester or Birmingham, yeah.
Yeah, what I mean as a regional, as a regional capital, as opposed to as a major.
Sorry, yeah, of course, yeah.
So within the UK, there are subdivisions of that of this nation, and there are major. Yeah. So Munich is, I suppose, I just don't want to insult anyone from Munich. You know, Bavaria, Munich, good, but crucially, yeah, it is important that these questions are examined. I suppose I'm curious though. I mean, because obviously, to that extent, or to a certain extent, these news articles they sort of talk for them, they speak for themselves. You know, the announcement that for example Germany is going to look into this is commendable, but I can't help but wonder why is it that that these issues are so hot at the moment, if you see what I mean. And the reason why I ask that, the reason why I ask is that I also reflect in the context of, for example, earlier in this watching brief we've been talking about Stonehenge, on the quite right supposition that if someone, for example, during the English Civil War decided that Stonehenge was at risk and took it to France maybe to keep it safe for humanity. There's no way on earth we would have countenanced that. It's fascinating how Western museums have for so long held on to some sort of legitimacy when it comes to their international collections, especially when it comes to, for example, Egypt. You know, so the French and the Germans and the British and their relationship to those monuments.
But if you look at the case of Egypt, for example, some of the I won't say the earliest, but certainly by the middle of the 19th century, there were quite strong laws in Egypt preventing the export of antiquities without licenses. That free for all, which led to, Napoleon trying to take the Rosetta Stone to Paris, and the ship was captured by the British, and it ended up in the British Museum in London. Wasn't going to happen after after that, and the story really, I think, is of increasing consciousness and agency among the former the nations, the countries that were subjected to that kind of collecting. And now we see art and culture as global. We respect much more than we did before, at least nominally, ownership and heritage and significance, and argue that something is culturally less significant if it's removed from its national and cultural context. So, for example, you wouldn't have a modern equivalent of the. Yeah, put it this way: British Expeditionary Force goes to what's now Nigeria in the late 19th century, burns the regional capital, and brings back the Benin bronzes, which are now a large number of which are now in the British Museum. A British Expeditionary Force goes to Iraq and Afghanistan in the 21st century, and the soldiers are given training in respecting and preventing damage to cultural artifacts. It's a completely different world.
Yeah. Well, okay. On a related issue, then, should modern Brits be held, or modern Europeans, in the context of Germany, for example, be held accountable for this? The reason why I say this is that, for example, on this YouTube channel, we have a video or videos examining, for example, the Parthenon marbles, so-called Elgin marbles, and it's quite clear that some people in Greece get very passionate about this, and they accuse modern Brits of being thieves, blackguards, scum, all this kind of thing. Is it actually our responsibility to make it right, given that this is not something we would do anymore, if you see what I mean?
That is probably one of the most knotty questions that you can ask anybody who works in heritage, I think. My own view, and it's purely a personal view, is that I don't believe that people of our generation, of subsequent generations, even the previous generation, our parents' generation, we didn't, we didn't run the government at the time that, the Summer Palace in Beijing was burnt. We didn't take the Parthenon marbles. We didn't take the Benin bronzes. We did, we did not condone and exploit African people as who had been enslaved. We are not responsible for that. We can regret that any of those things ever happened, but we have to deal with them in the present, not as though we were living in the past and are directly responsible. Therefore, we have to take a very careful and nuanced view, and I think that can only do it on a case-by-case basis.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned, for example, Britain and its relationship to, for example, the slave trade. The Golden Triangle, the way other phrases have been used to describe it. Liverpool, in particular, was one of the stop-off points for that trade, and we've talked in the past.
Bristol, where I used to live as well.
Well, and we talked in the past about how those different cities deal with that as an identity and this kind of thing. But it is interesting how, in the case of slavery, Britain actually, we quite quickly rushed to say, but we were one of the first to outlaw slavery, and we celebrate that, and all this kind of, so the 200
and compensated the slave owners, not the slaves.
Yeah, well, yeah.
So exactly, that's where it gets complicated.
Yes, well, and this is my point. It's more comfortable in some respects to bring up the mistakes that we feel as though we have addressed and we have eaten our humble pie over. But I suppose I find it interesting that it is tempting to say, oh, we wouldn't do that anymore. We wouldn't go to Greece and take any sculpture. And then that's kind of where the conversation for lots of people sort of seems to stop. And in the case of, for example, Scotland Yard, the goal is to basically set up an international database. It'll be a public, open access database of objects and art that will essentially tag and track this stuff and make sure that it's much harder to let this stuff bleed into a private market. And the reason why I'm not focusing on that is because actually our media pick of the month focuses on this issue quite heavily. So we'll be coming back to this issue of as it were, black market and provenance and this sort of stuff. But it's my point is though it is tempting, especially for example as a modern archaeologist, to say to a certain extent, well, that's not my problem. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't condone it. And that the issues surrounding, especially for the most high-profile one being the Parthenon marbles, that is an international governmental level discussion that has to happen, and one day, hopefully, fingers crossed, it'll be resolved. I suppose I'm curious, especially having just recently visited some very, so I saw some beautiful, internationally famous things like the portraits of the second, third century sort of Roman sarcophagi from Alexandria on display in the Munich Museum, and as much as I was honoured and so happy to see this stuff face to face, as it were, quite literally, in fact, it also made me just reflect on is it my right to be able to see that in Germany? You see what I mean? That's where my personal reflection brought me, but I'm just wondering whether or not this is something that actually we as archaeologists, you and I, and also people watching this who maybe have related interests, should actually be asking ourselves much more personal questions about these collections, because it's convenient, without a doubt. I love the fact that I can go to London and see all this beautiful stuff, but should we actually be confronting ourselves with the, I mean, I suppose, I know I'm asking a very wide, big question there, but I suppose that just to sort of cap it off a little bit as a question, maybe it would be a good idea, like where fruit is often given like a carbon footprint rating, this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Maybe artifacts should be presented with a sort of a brief bio of how that thing ended up in the museum, and people can then make decisions about whether or not they think whether they think they have a right to look at it, and whether or not they want to be, I suppose, party to that. If so, I mean.
That's a very interesting question. I mean, I think to give it, if museums, for example, started to give their artifacts a sort of, to take the old cartoon cliche, the burglar's swag bag rating. So if you had 3 swag bags, it was seriously iffy. If you had 1 swag bag, it was probably okay to look at it and enjoy it just without having to think about it too much.
Or for example, something related to like these energy ratings that houses get.
Yeah,
kind of
I know what you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm being facetious there. But,
no, I know.
I think we have to accept that the great international museum collections, the British Museum, the New York Met, the Louvre, the Pergamon in Berlin, mm-hmm. The great museum collections around the world, the National Museum in Cairo, which is, again, there's a new museum being built in Cairo. All these places are, in a sense, artifacts in their own right. The collections within them are, if you like, the contents of the urn. The museum is the urn which holds these things. The collection is the content, and the collection has a story. And it might be an ugly story in some respects, but as long as we're fair and accept that and tell that complete story, that material is being shared, it is being interpreted, it is being made available. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to get into the argument about more people could see the Parthenon marbles in London than would if they were in Athens and things like that. I think that's a false story. The British Museum is what it is. The New York Met is what it is. And I think to start to, deconstruct those collections would actually be, it might actually be eventually what people decide to do in due course. But I think at the moment, for me, that's not the best way forward.
So to a certain extent, then, if you do, just going along these lines of these being an artifice, museums as culturally constructed, folky, low-key of artifacts, maybe at the moment it is enough to be getting people to see the artifice, to understand that this is a construct, and then getting them to question how that construct has come about, perhaps.
And we are seeing, I think, more flexibility in terms of loans. The modern technologies like 3D printing, which can give you an absolute, laser scanning and 3D printing can give you a completely accurate facsimile of something if you're going to send something off on loan somewhere.
I think the current margin of error is 5 millimeters.
Yeah, you can argue about facsimile versus original and so on. So there's again. We'll just end up chasing our tails in increasingly complex and disparate arguments with this. It's a very, very difficult issue.
Okay. Well, just as someone from North Wales, I would say that the Mould Gold Cape belongs in North Wales. Never forgive, never forget. British Museum. # Mould Gold Cape. No, I'm joking. I'm joking. No, but in all seriousness, there is even within countries, actually, within Britain, there is a tendency, for example, the British Museum just to breathe everything into itself, and this is part of the problem as well.
And they have been, for example, sharing the Lewis Chessman with the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, and I think they've even gone back to was it Orkney or Shetlands? I can't never remember which one.
Shetland. I think.
Shetland, I think. Isle of Lewis, so so those things are acknowledged more than they used to be. And in fact, more regional museums are, where they can, bidding for example, significant fines that come up through the Portable Antiquities Scheme. They're staying local rather than national. The most famous being the Staffordshire Hall, which was exhibited in Birmingham and then toured around the Midlands.
And also in that sense as well, there is an element here whereby the local museums, it's more and more cost effective. High quality security measures are less and less expensive.
Yes,
is what I'm getting at. So a local museum now actually can look after an international artifact much more easily than arguably even 15 years ago. Certainly within my lifetime.
One of the arguments for Northampton Council flogging Sekemka was that they couldn't afford the insurance. In fact, that was shown from an FOI not to be true. But in fact, the FOIs make exactly the point you've made, that statue could have been secured perfectly easily and relatively cheaply.
But that just like Mould Gold Cape, that's something else. But
that's an example of an artifact that the provenance was broadly understood, but the documentation wasn't there to prove it was exported from Egypt legally. And the Egyptian government.
And then there was a question about
it.
And then there was a question about whether or not the British aristocratic owner of the statue had the right to pledge it as a legacy to the local people.
All of that. And
then, it's...
and in fact, the legal arguments around that were never made public. I hope they will be one day, but maybe comes up with one of our later stories, but or one of our media picks. But it's. But again, it just shows how complicated these things are.
Anyway, I had a lovely trip to Munich. It was nice.
I'm jealous. I've heard everybody I've ever met who's been to Munich said what a wonderful city it is to visit. So
it is. It's a great place to go, definitely.